So I'm going to talk about open innovation in a centralised system and kind of some of the areas I'm working on and some of the challenges I see and possibly some ideas that might lead to potential solutions. So I work down in Trinity College. I've been working there a year and a half, about 2 years out of my PhD. And there's actually having a conversation with some of the people at the table about, well, what actually is open innovation? It's not that easy to define. You know, there's some nice diagrams and definitions. When you say to someone with open, you know, I work in open innovation or I'm interested in open innovation, it's not always obvious what it is, and it can.
Excuse me, can you speak up?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So, yeah, I was just saying I was having a conversation about what open innovation was at the table I was at, and it was kind of hard to ultimately define. But I think open innovation is key to academic research. Academic research is all about talking to people, collaboration. You don't have someone sitting in a room on their own, you know, working away, coming up with all these great ideas. It's all about teams working together. It's vital to good research. And most research is collaborative, and especially good research, it happens when there is collaboration. In the lab I'm in, the speech communication lab, you know, we have a constant flow of guest researchers, PhD students, postdocs coming in, and it's a brilliant sharing of ideas. And you know, obviously in academia, all that collaboration and communication is put out in things like journal articles, papers, posters, presentations. So, you know, by and large, it's quite public. There is a bit of a move towards greater transparency. There is a lot of debate happening now, especially in the States, about, you know, access to public research. And you know, journals taking publicly funded research and charging for it, and there is a big move towards greater transparency, open access journals, and the metrics for kind of judging an academic, by and large, were and still pretty much are: how many papers have you got? Journal papers, posters, conference papers, and funding. But that's kind of changing, and I've actually started to see this in various people I've talked to who are involved in other research groups, that they're kind of building outreach into the projects now. So there'll be a lot more outreach, and that'll be part of the metrics that are used to judge how well a project is doing. You know, engagement with the community, bringing people outside from within, you know, the relatively closed university walls, bringing people in, showing what's going on, and getting people engaged. And interestingly, actually, I just read yesterday the government had gave a press release on their new R&D policy. They're trying to make it easier for businesses to get access and commercialise results from publicly funded research, because they recognise fundamentally there's a lot of great results, but sometimes you can't really see the forest for the trees, and you need someone to come along and say, hey, you know, that actually has commercial potential. That's quite interesting. That kind of happened in my case, which I'll talk about in a little bit after this. But they've also changed the remit of Science Foundation Ireland now to include applied research. I found that a little bit surprising, but there is this drive for applied research and commercialisation in research. So now it's kind of moving away from just, okay, well, you've got this many journal publications, well done. It's, okay, well, you've commercialised this amount of research. You've started up this number of companies, you've started up, you know, one or two, or you've licensed it out. You've actually taken what you've done and put it out there. And there's, you know, numerous reasons for that. Current economic climate we're in, obviously, if you're looking for large amounts of money, they want tangible outputs. You know, people who are giving you the money want to know, well, actually, what's it going to do? You know, is this going to create jobs? This is what people are asking at the moment. So there's closer scrutiny of what's going on. So there's a recognition of, well, there has to be a real world application. You know, can we get jobs out of this? Can we get some more money so that we can funnel this back into research? And it's also brought about by rapid technological change. So the universities aren't the only ones doing all this great research. Industry is the only group doing really great research and coming up with, you know, innovative products and ideas. There's not necessarily a threat, but a challenge from end users and consumers as innovators and creators themselves, who are arguably a lot more agile and lean than some of these larger entities. So there's this drive now to engage with industry, pull industry in as research partners. And in the Irish context especially, you know, we've all heard this knowledge economy, you know, and that's going to need businesses and academia to work together, to take some of the outputs, from academia and feed that into the business world, and then take the expertise and the knowledge from the business world, and feed that into academia and say, well, actually, here's how we do things that we found to be quite successful. So I find this quite interesting because we have this juxtaposition of academic and commercial. And for me, it doesn't not necessarily a problem, but it presents some challenges. You go from an open innovation in academia, but how do you maintain that when you're talking about commercialization? Because one of the things that always crops up is IP protection. And once you talk about IP protection, you're kind of limiting who you can talk to, who you can engage with, because investors are the people who are paying your wage and people are taking time to work on things. They want to know that their IP is protected. So if you're significantly investing in something, time and resources, you want to know that you're going to get something worthwhile out of that. So we have this nice funnel model, and it's interesting. Does commercialization, and especially something like IP protection, close that down? Does it preclude and limit open innovation? I'm not necessarily saying it does. I think it's quite interesting to look at it and see, does it actually, or are there ways around it if it does? Because you have this sort of clash. In the commercial world, some of the goals are arguably more immediate than research goals. Long-term research goals, over a few years, don't necessarily meet up quite well with some of the more shorter-term commercial goals. So it's quite interesting to see that feeding in as well, and more short, medium, and long-term deliverables becoming part of academic projects rather than this kind of ultimate end game after 3 or 4 or 5 years of research. And again, what are the everyday applications? There's a lot of research projects out there now that are building this into their research proposals. What's going to mean to the man on the street? What's the non-academic going to do with this? How is it useful? So I think it's exciting. I think it's challenging. I think it's an interesting problem area. And we really need to look at it and address it to kind of keep pace with some of the changes that are going on right now. So in my current, to put it in context from where I'm coming from, I work on a project called FASTNET. It's an SFI funded. It's focused on social talk network enabling technology. It's social computing, human-computer interaction, robot-computer interaction. And what we want to do is build technology or tools that kind of take the social aspect of communication into context. So, very simply, this might be a bit glib, but computer communication is just passing notes, sending messages, getting messages back. If we use the example of Siri on the iPhone, because Steve Jobs was mentioned a lot, you ask Siri something and it gives you an answer back, but it doesn't consider where you are in terms of your GPS coordinates, what mood you're in, what you've done later on in the day. Is it appropriate to give you the answer that you've looked for? It doesn't take any of that into account. And so you're cutting out a huge amount of information, because all human communication is social. Humans are fantastic social communicators. Even if you think, but I'm not actually great at talking to people, you're probably a lot better than you think you are, because when we're talking to people, we're watching everything subconsciously, gesture, body language, tone of voice. That's what I'm particularly interested in, is how something is said, rather than what's said. But again, machines, robots, any sort of speech interface or any sort of interface at all doesn't take that into account. Doesn't kind of take back this continuous feedback. It's not aware. So we're interested in building context-aware technology. So where I'm currently coming from is I did a little bit of research, and again, building on that open innovation paradigm, I went out and looked at what a lot of other people have done in a certain area in terms of speech and communication. Found a lot of interesting stuff out there and realized, well, actually, there's some areas I think that can be improved on, that I can, possibly add value to. So designing some research, carrying out some research, again, built on other people's work, not me sitting on my own discussing things with my team, a few of us working on it. I got some interesting results, and it was literally just a graph on a piece of paper that I'd drawn up for an accepted publication. I thought, actually, that's quite interesting. Maybe there's something in that. And I just happened to hear that university-wide they're kind of pushing for, well, if you have something that you think might be useful, think about commercialization. Before you go and rush out and put everything in a paper and put it out there publicly, can you get something more out of it? So I went and spoke to the technology transfer office in Trinity. Said, well, here's an idea I have. Just, it's very, very basic. And I just actually happened to bump into someone at an SFI EI showcase in the storehouse, and I was kind of saying, you know, I have an idea, it's very basic, really needs a lot more work, and it was a brilliant bit of advice. Said, don't wait till you have everything done. Don't wait till you have this complete tangible thing, you know, because what will happen is you'll have done a lot of things in terms of bringing it to the finished product that, you know, you might not necessarily have done, you know, following again the lean canvas and the minimum viable product. And the person I was talking to said, well, you know what, a lot of researchers wait till the very end. They think, I have to have this ultimately tangible result. I have to have everything done. And you don't. And I was told, you know what, if you have a commercial idea, go the commercial route. Because again, it pulls in all that knowledge and even what we were talking about today about, you know, the business canvas and minimum viable product. What's the basic that you need to get this out there for customers to use? Which is not really the way a researcher would tend to think. They think of all the things it can't do, all the holes, all the work that has to be done, rather than we're at this stage now and that's good enough to take it forward and start getting some feedback. So I had an idea. It was originally for, you know, this might be a way of searching through large amounts of audio for audio archiving and retrieval. I spoke to people in RTE who have, you know, massive amount of material. I was even thinking, you know, BBC have a huge amount of material. And one of the biggest problems they have is annotating and indexing it. You know, what happens at this point in time? So when researchers are coming to look for, you know, a video clip of two people talking about a certain topic, that's all dependent on someone having gone through that and marked that up. So I thought, well, actually, this might be a way of just pulling out interesting bits of information. And TTO said, okay, great, but you need to get out of the building. You need to get out and you need to talk to other people. You need to talk to someone who isn't involved in the research and, you know, has a good overview of the market in various different ways, and, you know, see what they think. And I actually went and spoke to Connor. Had a quick coffee with Connor, said, here's the idea. And Connor suggested, well, actually, have you thought about some of other following areas, you know? And I hadn't, because I was just focusing on this one area. So by talking to people, you know, we kind of realized that, well, actually, this could be deployed in a number of areas, you know. Has worked in communicative effectiveness in stressful mission-critical environments, you know, like aviation, high-end tech support, possibly even in diagnosis in areas like psychiatric diagnosis or, you know, surgical environment. So again, just by kind of going out and talking to people, kind of changed the course of it, and that's kind of what we're focusing on at the moment. So where it stands now is we carried out a very small-scale feasibility study, spoke to people in various markets, said, actually, you know, that's a good idea, we'd be interested in, here's some do's and don'ts, here's our thoughts on it. Went very well, so that we've got some development funding, and the idea is we'll, you know, 12 to 14 months we'll be developing a commercially viable piece of software. And the interesting thing for me then is having gone from open innovation, collaborating with who I want, to, you know, commercializing some of it. There's various other things that I never would have thought about that I'd have to start considering. And one of them is obviously IP protection, because any papers that I write now and any journals that I might want to publish to, I have to get someone to read over and say, actually, you're giving away everything there. Don't publish that. You know, wait till we have some form of IP protection. And so I'm interested in kind of, you know, is this an obstacle to open innovation? I'm not necessarily saying it is. It's just kind of a question I want to put out there, because before I wouldn't have any problem talking to someone saying, here's my idea, which I did initially and got lots of great feedback, but now I have to be a little careful. Even at an early stage where there's still a lot of unanswered research questions, I have to be careful about, you know, who I talk to and how I talk to them. And I lecture up on the Web Elevate course up in the Digital Skill Academy. And one of the things I talk about in my lectures on technology and social and cultural aspects of it, and, you know, how social and cultural change drives technological change and vice versa, is kind of the patent wars that we're seeing now, like big companies hoovering up patents just to protect themselves from other companies and challenge other companies. And Samsung and Apple are engaged in a big patent war at the moment. You know, so, you know, this is it too protectionist? Does it exclude the possibility of building on current work? And one of the criticisms kind of leveled at Google sometimes as well, actually all this kind of patent war you're getting into, if that was happening when you were developing your algorithm and your search engine, you possibly wouldn't have been able to do what you did, because it would have all been patent protected. So, you know, innovation is all about improving, adapting, and utilizing. And it's not necessarily about coming up with something completely and utterly new that no one's ever thought about before. Because again, whatever idea you have, plenty of other people around the world have the same idea. So if all art is derivative, can the same be said for innovation? So kind of getting too caught up in IP protection, you can be having an argument over one side of the room where people who don't really worry about IP protection and just interested in innovating and creating pass you by. And one of those challenges, the direct challenges that we have, is from consumer user-led innovation, which again is another, I think, great example in open innovation. And Charles Ledbetter, who has been talking about this for a long, long time, gave a TED talk back in 2005, and he was talking about user-led innovation. And he used the example of mountain bikes, and he said, if you ask anyone where the mountain bike came from, which is a multi-million dollar market, they'd probably tell you, oh yeah, mountain bike company, or one of the bike companies, Raleigh or someone else, invented it and sold it. Well, what actually happened was bikers, people who cycled a lot, didn't really like some of the bikes that are out there, didn't really suit their needs. They wanted to go maybe a bit more off-road. They weren't happy with some of the way it was constructed, so they took bits from other bikes, stuck them together to create the mountain bike. And the point Charles is making in that is that, if you were to ask these companies about, it didn't come from those companies, and if you were to ask them about, well, why don't you create a whole new bike? They'd kind of say, well, why would we need to? At that stage, they weren't necessarily talking to consumers and getting user feedback. But the important point he's making is that this happened when no one was kind of paying attention to it. It just, people went out there and next thing, wow, this kind of holistic consumer user-led approach led to the mountain bike. And what I'm kind of interested in is, while people are having arguments over one side about commercialization and IP, over the other side of the room is there's people who don't really kind of worry about that. They're just interested in creating useful tools. A kid in the room who's a fantastic coder looks at a piece of software out there and goes, I can do that better, or I can mod that in the way I want, and create something new and brilliant. And IP and commercialization doesn't even kind of come into it. So I kind of worry that if we don't kind of address it now, we might get too caught up in trying to sort it out, and people who aren't interested in that or care about that will just bypass it. And all the good ideas that we might have, someone else has had it and just gone off and done it. And I think there's a few possible models that we might necessarily learn from. They're not the ultimate answer, but they're things that I think we can pull down from. Something like Creative Commons, it allows different levels of use of people's copyrighted material. So you can say to someone, yeah, you can use my photograph for free, as long as it's not for profit. It is for profit, maybe give a bit of money to charity, maybe give me a certain small percentage, but there's this kind of level where you're not kind of saying, well, actually, to use it, you have to abide by these strict terms. So it's quite flexible and open. Interestingly as well, I think the whole Kickstarter crowdfunding thing, it allows people to engage with users without sacrificing IP. So again, it's pulling in people from outside, getting them involved at various different levels without sacrificing IP and without having to kind of give away the core of whatever it is you're building or trying to commercialize. I think in particular the games industry is a great example because they've really embraced user-led innovation. Modding, for example, if there's any gamers out there, modding is basically, you take a game that's out there and you modify it to do something that it couldn't do. So usually it's to improve it. No one ever modifies something to make it worse. They mod it to improve it. And so what happened was, games companies noticed that, well, this game we released 5 or 6 years ago, it's still going in various different forms, but it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And one company in particular, Valve, kind of one of the biggest, most successful games companies, but more importantly, one of the most liked games companies, kind of said, you know what, that's really interesting. And rather than try and fight that and say, actually, you can't do that to our source code, you're not allowed. They said, well, actually, why don't we just give them the source code? Why don't we say, okay, here you go, off you go. We've built a game, we've got whatever you want out of it, have it. And even more importantly, they actually start saying, well, you know what, you're really good at what you do, do you want a job? So they continuously engage with their kind of end users and get feedback. And they do that through, all sorts of techniques, like early releases of games. People, play them, come back with bug reports and say, great, here's the final game for you, thanks a million. They just really incentivize users to get involved. And I think it's a great example of open innovation. And they've kind of taken the different track to, say, the music industry, who's kind of fighting a rearguard action. So rather than a few years ago say, we should really be looking at this new technology, looking what users are doing, looking what consumers are doing, and kind of embracing it and trying to, fit our business model. Rather than kind of force that into our business model, we should adapt our business model. they should have been looking at how consumers are innovating in the same way Charles Ledbetter gave that example of the mountain bike. Mountain bikes are sold by a whole load of bike companies now. They make a lot of healthy profit, even though they weren't the sole originators of it. So what I'm interested in is when you move from that kind of open innovation academic area, which is quite important in terms of innovation and commercialization, that are you closing down what kind of makes that good, what makes that what it is, and are there possible ways around it? And because again, the challenges are coming from areas that we didn't think. It's not other universities or other companies. It's other groups of people. It's kids. It's non-commercial groups. It's who are agile and lean and aren't getting tied up in this kind of framework. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Is there one thing you'd really like to change about how universities do innovation at present? If you had your wish.
It's a hard one because I don't want to say that I have all the answers because there obviously is a need for IP protection.
Yeah.
But you can't be carrying around a bunch of pre-signed NDAs in your pocket and say, actually, that's a great idea. Sign this, please, and we can go and have a talk about it. So I think if there's a way of kind of bringing in outside expertise that doesn't necessarily compromise the IP, but also as well, when academics are commercializing stuff, I think there needs to be a kind of a commercial mind or a kind of a parallel track of not someone overseeing, but kind of popping in, kind of going, that's really good, or have you considered this? Because it's for a lot of, especially for myself and a lot of people, it's kind of a whole new world, and it's kind of trial by fire. So having someone there to go with the experience to say, here's what we should be looking on, here's what we should be focusing on.
Sounds like a whole new exciting world.
It's interesting, and it's some nice challenges that I think will come about organically rather than some sort of immediate change.
Does anybody have a question for Brian? Anybody have? Sorry, yourself.
Thanks, Brian. Great talk. I'd like to use a present. I think more people should
we're impressed with that.
One quick question on there's a bit of a drive at the moment from Enterprise Ireland and from government for funding for commercialisation of research. And I was at a talk a few months ago by a professor in entrepreneurship in Texas, and he said this is a very dangerous place to go because when he arrived in Texas at first, they had maybe 2 or 3 pieces of IP coming out a year. He was told his metric was IP. About 2 years later, he had about 100 pieces of IP coming out a year. He looked like he was doing great, but as he said himself, it was just to get the numbers up. So they've moved towards the turnover that's coming from the IP that they're developing, and also the profit that they're getting from the IP that's developed. Now in Ireland, we're not doing that. No. Is that something you think we should be moving towards? Because essentially we're producing useless IP for the sake of having IP, and there is an industry around this that's holds back entrepreneurship.
That is the danger, just like saying, well, actually we're going to judge in how many papers you publish. So you publish a lot of papers, and they might not necessarily be the best. Whereas if you take your time and publish, say, 3 or 4 rather than 10, 3 or 4 really good papers, better than having 10 slightly okay papers. So I think in terms of when you're talking about IP, obviously you can't just look and say, well, you've got 10 patents, 20 patents, you've got this many startups, this many licenses. It's like, well, actually, are they any good? And what is the turnover? We do need a new set of metrics, and there's a whole other argument actually about commercialization, and not all research is commercial. You can't commercialize everything. So does that mean that it's no good, or that it's not as useful, or that commercial research will be graded higher and get more attention, and other areas like the arts and humanities, to be honest, will kind of suffer. But that's why it's interesting, because we're seeing this more and more, and we're seeing projects kind of starting to build in things like outreach and commercial output as well as level of metric. But yeah, we have to be careful we don't just count IP as the only kind of metric that we're looking at in terms of success for commercial output.